I think that Native communities could definitely participate more and benefit from a local food economy because that's our tradition. That's what our communities stem from those, centuries upon centuries of living within and using the natural resources around us. For us as Pueblo people, I always think about the audacity that came with the introduction of something called the BIA farmer, an individual who was sent into public communities around the turn of the century, ostensibly to educate Pueblo people on how to be farmers. When Pueblo people had been farmers for thousands and thousands of years, knew how to farm and what crops, for what crop varieties had cultivated, had nurtured all the crop varieties that we had here. And of course, federal Indian policy at the time nationally was to convert nomadic, semi-nomadic tribes into sedentary farmers. But they came in with this cookie-cutter approach here without recognizing the thousands and thousands of years of history of agriculture here. And similar experiences took place out at the Navajo Nation, with sheep herding that had been incorporated into Navajo tradition. And there were some very painful parts of Navajo history where the federal government came in and intruded in the management of Navajo sheep. And so we have the opportunity here to revive and to restore and to strengthen traditions that are long part of our communities, relying upon locally produced foods, locally gathered foods. We talked about agriculture, we talked about animal husbandry and about livestock, but there's also the farming, the tradition that we have of hunting and of gathering. We're very fortunate in New Mexico to have a wide variety of biological zones here in our state. So, you can go from very, almost desert-like conditions in a couple of hours to, alpine and subalpine mountain peaks. And, you have all sorts of wildlife in there, deer, elk, turkey, all kinds of game animals, game birds. You have a variety of wild plants. My kids and I just finished the annual process of gathering something we call huan, which is the wild spinach. And we're fortunate it pops up in our yard, so it's not so wild. It's right in our front yard, but it has to be picked in a certain time before the plant flowers. Before that, so that was just they're starting to peak about 2 weeks ago. So we picked them about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and then you have to boil it. And it's not just a food source, it's also something that's been with us for a long time. It's used by the southern Pueblos to paint pottery, to create that black, the black paint after it's fired. It comes across as that very dark black paint. Before that was the time to pick something called simaha, which I believe might be called wild parsley. I don't really know what the English word is for it. But those are very much part of our traditions, wild celery. There's wild strawberries. There's all sorts of wild onions in my field. When they clear the fields, they plow them and they disc them. They kick out a bunch of these little wild potatoes, and they're just tiny. They look like marbles. But all these are still with us. But we've been convinced, we've been conditioned, a lot of our tribal communities, to move away from those foods. And it goes back to the BIA farmer. It goes back to interference in those traditions and ideas about, well, that's, those aren't the right types of foods you should be eating, or the crops you grow aren't the right types of crops. You need to introduce these other types of crops that are more hardy, quote unquote. Then the introduction of pesticides, the introduction of fertilizers, all these things that really interrupted a very long history of being self-sufficient and self-sustaining. So I think there's a lot of interest I see in a lot of the communities now to restore those. But the challenges, I think, are ones that I've mentioned, is we live in a cash economy, and many people, especially those that are working jobs that are barely paying a living wage, you have to work 2, 3 jobs. How are you going to have time to get out there and produce your own food and to care for those things? So all those, I think, come into play, but I think there's tremendous opportunities in tribal communities in New Mexico to really develop out and restore our local food systems.